Good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we are celebrating the memorial of St. Francis de Sales. Now, this St. Francis is not the same St. Francis that began the Franciscan order, but this St. Francis was a bishop and a doctor of the church. He's the patron of Catholic writers, of the Catholic press. He's the patron of the deaf and of journalists and adult education in general. And he lived from 1567 to 1622 in Geneva, Switzerland during the time of the Calvinist Reformation. In fact, he's particularly noted for bringing somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 Calvinists back into the Catholic Church, and that must have been a monumental undertaking. But one of the things that really stuck out to me about this saint is how he was at odds with his parents. You know, he was born into a noble family, so he was kind of well off, and his family wanted him to begin a career and a study in law. Well, he did, in fact, get his doctorate from the University of Padua in law, but St. Francis never really felt at peace with what his parents were calling him to do with his life, because ultimately he knew that God had a different will for his life that involved a vocation in ministry. And I really like how the responsorial psalm today calls our attention to this theme of doing God's will. We see in Psalm 40, verse 2, I have waited for the Lord. He stooped toward me and he put a new song into my mouth, a hymn to our God. And then we see that response that we repeat over and over after these verses in Psalm 40, which is, Here am I, Lord, I come to do your will. So this theme was really sticking out to me as I was reading about St. Francis de Sales, this idea of, Here am I, Lord, I come to do your will. And as St. Francis could never shake this desire to do God's will in his life, as I was contemplating that, it really brought a couple things to mind. One, it made me recall the grief I took from my stepdad when I told him I was going into the ministry. He literally said to me, David, you have a successful landscaping business in a thriving community. You have over 335 accounts, a two-story home, nice cars, a family. Why would you throw all that away to go work for some church? Now, I don't look poorly on my stepfather for saying this, because he was just kind of sharing with me his own wisdom and experience and reason from a very materialistic point of view. He wasn't very spiritual in his day. And those were kind of his exact words. And it made me think about what I was doing a lot more, which actually helped me come to a better decision about having a vocation in ministry and what that meant for me in my life. So I was thankful that he challenged me on it, because I went into a deeper discernment over the vocation because of that. But ultimately, I did decide that I wanted to do what God was calling me to do. So I went into vocational ministry. And one of the things that comforted me during that time was some verses that are actually in our reading today from Jesus that we see in Mark 3:35, where Jesus said, For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. And that was actually a comforting verse for me when I was transitioning, selling my business and all that, in transitioning into vocational ministry. And looking back, I recall the peace that God gave me to make that transition. And so perhaps there's someone out there today that's considering a call of vocational ministry, and you have these voices coming from maybe your family or friends. Hey, why would you do that? Think about the life you have. I want to encourage you today to just trust the Lord if he's calling you to vocational ministry, and take that step of faith and really understand that God's not going to call you and then not take care of you. I've never missed a meal unless I've chosen to because of fasting since I went into vocational ministry, but it has been a wonderful blessing in my life. And and it kind of made me think of something else too, and that is, what kind of a mold am I trying to fit my own children into? Is my idea for them taking into account God's will for their life? Even being a minister myself, I think as a parent, I think all of us as parents, we can kind of get into this idea of having a mold that we want our kids to get into. And sometimes we need to stop and say, and just kind of look at what God's doing in our children's life and say, okay, but what is God's will for my children? It kind of made me think of this wisdom from Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, where it says, train the young in the way they should go, and even when old, they will not swerve from it. And I think as Christians, sometimes we usually take this to mean we need to indoctrinate our children into the faith, specifically our faith, our denominational faith. But in contemplating this, I think there's more to it. I think that as parents, God wants us to pay close attention to the gifts and abilities God has given our children and the way that God is directing their life. And then as parents, for us to assist them. If our children have extreme skills in a certain thing, then we need to encourage them in that because, chances are God's involved in that. And, one of the things I really loved is that St. Francis de Sales, as he matured in the faith, he became quite a mystic, and he was pursuing nothing short of union with God. So there was times where even his fellow clergymen were giving him grief about how he was following God's will. And in fact, I recently began reading his book here, which is Philothea, an introduction to a devout life. And in this book, he says, by turning your eyes to God in meditation, your whole soul will be filled with God. Begin all your prayers in the presence of God. So when we're trying to discern God's will, what St. Francis is saying is that we really need to come into God's presence. And as you look at all the different meditations he has in the beginning of the book, the first step is place yourself in the presence of God. We look at this other one, meditation, place yourself in the presence of God. Again, another meditation, place yourself in the presence of God. This is how he always began his meditation in this work, the devout life. And another part, he says, retire at various times into the solitude of your own heart, even while outwardly engaged in discussions or transactions with others, and talk to God. Now, I think this is really good for us in this busy world that we have to take times and stop. And so as I was thinking about the application this week and how this is all related to doing God's will and the way I saw this struggle, not only in the saint's life, but in my own life, when it comes to what people want you to do versus what you feel God calling you to do, this is what I think the application for the journey should be today. So it's this: take a moment in the morning, at noon, and in the evening to become aware of the presence of God, and then listen for God's will on your life. And remember that sometimes God will call you to something that maybe other people don't understand or don't agree with. Well, I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for the memorial of St. Francis de Sales. I hope to see you next week. If you haven't subscribed already, please just go ahead and subscribe.